helping to make a difference to your bank balance. Super Savvy Savings.
Well, it's time once again for our Super Savvy Savings feature, which we need more than ever before at the moment during the cost of living crisis. Today we talk to a man from Hove who's doing a series of podcasts on dealing with debt in the midst of this cost of living crisis. Here's a clip from one of Ripon podcasts.
As I was growing up, I didn't know the meaning of food banks, and the demands for food banks have become more important than ever before. According to Trussell Trust, a franchise of food banks, there are over 1,400 food banks throughout the UK. It would not be of surprise to anyone that either you, as a pensioner or on GIS contract, is going to be a knife edge due to the rise in inflation, cost of fuel, food, rent, to name just a few. An unfortunate decision will no doubt be made by those who are struggling whether to pay rent, heat, or eat.
And I'm delighted to welcome into the studio Ripon, who your podcast, I would imagine, providing a lot of people with help and support at the moment.
Sarah, thank you for inviting me. Absolutely. I think, believe it or not, when I first started the podcast, I didn't realise how open people would be to listen to it. And now, the way things have gone so far, I have debt collection companies, charities, Citizen Advice have taken part, Joseph Roundtree that funds organisations and do their research work. They've taken part to make sure when it comes to debt talk, we're looking at it holistically and looking at views from our broad range of communities fundamentally to support vulnerable communities.
I think sometimes debt is so frightening that people almost want to just pretend it's not there and sort of not deal with it, which is possibly, I would imagine, the worst thing that you can do.
I mean, Sarah, I've been in debt myself. When I was in my 20s, I remember receiving letters from debt collection companies and I couldn't pay my credit cards. So it's that experience on back of my mind that made me realise, okay, it is fine looking back. Now being an expert, but when I was there, I was digging myself into a black hole, and it wasn't nice at all. And especially at the time, I felt as though I was isolated, I was depressed, I was anxious. But really, the way I came out of it is through seeking help. And I think it's that sort of seeking help and then gaining and develop my confidence through advice work that forced me to now really, reach out to others to give back what I got.
What was quite interesting, we were just chatting off air, and I always assume that debt is credit card debt. That's what I instantly think. But actually, you were telling me that more and more people are falling into things like arrears with their council tax, those bills that we absolutely have to pay. They're not on an extra luxury.
No, I mean, you're right. Citizen Advice, Step Change, and also Money Advice Trust, they're the leading debt providers in the country. And they all provide free advice. And they can categorically tell you the number of cases that I've seen and they have seen are primarily connected with, sadly we have to accept it. It is about rent arrears, council tax arrears, and of course we have been for the last 6 months been talking about fuel suppliers and how we're going to cope when the cost of fuel supplies go up, and it has gone up by 1,000% since 2019.
It's astonishing that the increase in the cost of living. I know most of us have noticed it, but if you were already only just getting by, how are people coping? I mean, what advice can you give to someone for whom the sums just don't add up? The income doesn't match their outgoings. That's what a lot of people are faced with.
Yes, that is sadly, that is the case. When people are faced with that situation, I mean, do bear in mind though, debt advice work is a regulated activity. So in other words, the same regulator, Financial Conduct Authority, that regulates banks, i.e. lenders, credit card companies, the same regulator also regulates the debt advice market, i.e. Citizens Advice Bureau that delivers debt advice work. Now, in terms of what support is available, and believe me, this is when your regulator becomes your best friend without you knowing it, because the regulator makes it obviously clear when someone is in financial struggle, don't even think about your interest, Mr. Bank or Mr. Credit Card Companies. It is really, really about looking at it from the lens of those who are struggling.
So does that mean then that you need to take all your debt, go along to an advisor and say, okay, where do I start? What do I do with this? It sounds very much like trying to deal with it on your own is not wise advice.
No, I mean, absolutely not. I mean, believe it or not, some people are actually quite good at dealing with things by themselves. I mean, if you're talking about an accountant who suddenly lost his job, but he's fantastic with numbers, the only thing he or she might need is just, I suppose, a bit of guide. Here you go, here's a website. He will easily, run with it. But of course, you're right, Sarah, there is no one size fits all. That's the interesting thing about debt world, from my point of view, is that there is no one size fits all. But I must say, first thing you must do is talk to someone about it. I mean, we should always start from home. So let's say, for example, suddenly you find yourself in a struggle. If you don't talk to someone about it, you're not actually sharing a burden. Now, the reason that's important is because you realize that once you've opened yourself up to the problem and talk about it, it is actually a way to come out of the problem. So don't dig yourself a hole, not in silence. And then the other thing you must bear in mind is that in terms of when you have debt or several debts, it is about prioritizing your debts, i.e., as we talked about earlier, Sarah, rent arrears, council tax arrears, fuel suppliers. Now, in terms of those three are priority, because you and I know, if you don't pay your mortgage, if you don't pay your rent, they will try to evict you. The interesting thing about council tax, because it's basically money that you pay to your local government for public service providing purpose, i.e. collecting bins and things, ultimate sanction a council can give you, I guess, is imprisonment. That's what it is. So really, you have to think about non-payment of rent leads to eviction, therefore that is priority.
Right.
Non-payment of council tax is priority because the ultimate sanction a council has is put you in prison. And finally, of course, we say fuel supply is also priority because they can disconnect you, and you can imagine what it's like in winter when it's cold.
Absolutely. And I would imagine, though, if you have got credit card debt, some of those interest rates can be astonishingly high. But you would contact your credit card provider and say, can't pay it at the moment, and then would they be understanding in that situation, or does the interest continue to escalate?
Now, in terms of interest, interesting enough, it's all kind of boils down to contract of consumer credit that you've signed. So you're right, interest can escalate only if you don't liaise or communicate with the credit card company or a high interest company provider, because they will assume you have not been in contact with us to let us know that you're struggling, so we'll assume you're avoiding to pay. So obviously there's a difference between I'm struggling to pay and I'm letting you know, and avoiding to pay and I'm letting you know. So therefore the company will say, in this case, okay, interest will go up and up because you haven't told us that you're struggling. So that's why, yes, my other tip, Sarah, would be to say, if you're struggling, best to do, either landlords, even council tax, or even fuel supplies, is go and talk to them. And believe you me, they will then happily help you bend over backward.
Some really wise advice there. How do we find your podcast?
Now, absolutely, you can find my podcast, or Spotify, iTunes. Just Google it. Ripon Ray podcast is out there for you to listen. Please, please, please. Don't suffer in silence.
Well, very good to see you. Thank you so much for coming in the studio, and do have a look for Rip and Ray's podcast, which are surrounding the area of debt and advice on debt.
Call 0800 232 1045.
BBC Radio Sussex.